Hi, everyone. I'm Lisa Gevelber, and I'm the founder and lead for Grow with Google, which is Google's initiative to ensure economic opportunity for everyone. And I'm so excited to be here today with Kim Scott. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Kim, and I'm going to let her introduce herself. And at the end, I'm going to have plenty of time for questions. So please get your questions ready. So, Kim, besides being a near and dear friend of mine, is the author of two books, Radical Candor and Just Work. She's also the founder of two companies that were built around those books. And she has been a CEO coach to CEOs at places like Dropbox, Qualtrics, Twitter, and many other tech companies. And she's held leadership roles at several tech companies herself, including Google, but also Apple. Interesting, Kim has a crazy cool career. In addition to all of the things I just mentioned, she managed a pediatric clinic in Kosovo early in her career and started a diamond cutting factory in Moscow. I'm really delighted that I got to know Kim here at Google. She has had such an impressive career, but maybe more importantly, is an amazing human being. So before I go on any further, I want to introduce Kim herself and have her tell us a little bit about herself and about her career before she became an author.
Thank you so much. It is such a pleasure to be chatting with you, Lisa, and I love being back at Google, if only virtually. My years at Google, I was there 2004 to 2010, were definitely some of the best years of my life, and I was just saying to my husband, who also used to work at Google, how many of the people that we're still friends with and see today are people we met at Google. So it's great to be back. I did a bunch of different things in my career, but basically my whole business career was one giant plot to subsidize my novel writing habit, which may seem a strange way to go about it, but anyway, it seems to have worked out. I started the company Just Work and decided to write the book Just Work almost right after I wrote Radical Candor. So I wrote Radical Candor is a book about giving feedback. And if you write a book about feedback, you're going to get a lot of it. And indeed, I did. So shortly after the book came out, I was giving a Radical Candor presentation at a tech company in San Francisco. And the CEO of that company was actually a friend of mine who I had met at Google and had been a colleague for the better part of a decade. And when I finished giving, she's also one of too few Black women in tech, by the way. When I finished giving the presentation, she pulled me aside and she said, I got to tell you, Kim, I'm really excited about rolling out Radical Candor. It's going to help me build the kind of culture that I want, but it's much harder for me to put Radical Candor into practice than it is for you. She explained to me that as soon as she offered people even the most compassionate criticism, that she would get slimed with the angry Black woman stereotype. And I knew this was true. And as soon as she said it to me, I had kind of three revelations at the same time. The first was that I had failed to be the kind of colleague that I imagined myself to be. I had failed to notice the extent to which she showed up at every meeting I had ever been in with her, unfailingly pleasant and cheerful. I just had never taken into account the toll that must take on her. So I'd failed to be what I call in the book Just Work an upstander. I also realized that, and this is a hard thing for the author of a book called Radical Candor to admit, but I also realized suddenly that I had been in denial about the kinds of things that had happened to me as a white woman in the workplace. And I never wanted to see myself as a victim, but I was often. And even at Google, which I will say was the best place I ever worked as a woman. And last but not least, I realized that I had failed as a leader to create the kind of environment in which everyone could just work, could do the best work of their lives, participate fully. And so that was really what prompted me to write the book Just Work, and ultimately to start the company Just Work together with Trier Bryant. So that's a
Amazing.
couple of words on me and how I got to be where I am now, sitting and writing.
Amazing. Well, I think your writing has changed a lot of lives. I know it has here at Google. I think I mentioned this to you the other day, but we use Radical Candor to train every one of our managers in marketing globally. And I know it's making a difference. I know maybe we'll start with talking about Radical Candor a little bit, and then we'll move on to Just Work. But it's been 5 years since you wrote the book. It's both a New York Times and a Wall Street Journal bestseller. I think it's in 20 languages, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
And I think actually it's helped launch a management revolution of sorts, right? It's really practical suggestions about how to give and receive feedback, which sounds so simple, but I think so many of us struggle with in the workplace, but also outside of the workplace. And I think the premise of the book is around giving and receiving that feedback, but with empathy and clarity, right? I think which is
Yes.
something we all aspire to. So tell us a little bit about the origins of Radical Candor.
Yeah. So as you said, the idea of Radical Candor is care personally and challenge directly at the same time. But that hardly seems, caring and challenging don't seem so radical. So why did I call it Radical Candor? And I think I did because it's so rare to do both at the same time, and to give both at the same time, and also to receive both at the same time. So I think one of the sort of origin stories of Radical Candor happened actually shortly after I joined Google. I had to give a presentation about how the AdSense business was doing to the CEO and the founders, who were Eric Schmidt at the time was CEO, and Sergey and Larry were in the room. And I walked in, and there was Sergey sort of on an elliptical trainer wearing toe shoes, and there was Eric doing his emails, like with his head so deep in the machine, it's like his brain had been plugged in. And probably like all of you all watching this, I felt a little bit nervous. How in the world was I supposed to get their attention? Luckily for me, the AdSense business was on fire. And when I said how many publishers we had added over the last couple of months, Eric almost fell off his chair. What did you say? Do you need more marketing dollars? Do you need more engineers? So I'm feeling like the meeting's going all right. In fact, I now believe that I am a genius. And I walked past my boss, and I'm expecting a high five, a pat on the back. And instead she says to me, "Why don't you walk back to my office with me?" And I thought, oh, wow, I screwed something up, and I'm sure I'm about to hear about it. And she started the meeting not by telling me what I had done wrong, but what I had done right. And this is really crucial. I think a lot of people think Radical Candor is all about the boss criticizing the employee. It's much more about praise than about criticism, and it really starts with soliciting feedback. But anyway, all I wanted to do, of course, was hear about what I had done wrong. And eventually she said to me, "You said in there a lot. Would you like, were you aware of it?" And with this, I breathed a huge sigh of relief, because if that was all I had done wrong, who really cared? And I kind of made this brush off gesture with my hand. I said, "Yeah, I know it's a verbal tic. It's no big deal, really." And then she said, "I know this great speech coach. Would you like an introduction?" And once again, I made this brush off gesture with my hand. I was like, "Didn't you hear about all those new publishers? I don't have time to go to see a speech coach." And then she stopped, and she looked me right in the eye, and she said, "I can tell when you do that thing with your hand that I'm going to have to be a lot more direct with you. When you say every third word, it makes you sound stupid." Now she's got my full attention. And some people might say it was mean of her to say that I sounded stupid, but in fact, it was the kindest thing that she could have done for me at that moment in my career. Because if she hadn't used just those words with me, and by the way, and this is really important too, she would never have used those words with other people on her team who were perhaps better listeners than I was. But if she hadn't used just those words with me, I never would have gone to see the speech coach, and I wouldn't have realized that she was not exaggerating. I literally said every third word. And this was news for me, because I had been giving presentations for my whole career. I had raised millions of dollars for 2 different startups, giving presentations. I thought I was pretty good at it. And so this really got me to thinking, what was it about her that made it so seemingly easy for her to tell me, but also perhaps even more interestingly, why had no one else told me? It was almost like I'd been marching through my whole career with a giant hunk of spinach between my teeth, and nobody had told me, had the common courtesy to tell me it was there. And so that was when I really started to try to come up with a framework that would distill what it was that made it possible for her to tell me, because and what sort of made me realize it comes down to caring and challenging at the same time, and also what happens when we fail on one dimension or another. So sometimes, if you think about a 2x2 framework, sometimes we remember to challenge directly, but we forget to show that we're caring personally, and that I call obnoxious aggression. And in the first draft of the book, I called it the asshole quadrant because it seemed more radically candid. But I stopped doing that for a really important reason, because as soon as I did that, people would use this framework to start writing names in boxes. And I beg of you, don't use this framework that way. This is not another Myers-Briggs personality test. Use the framework like a compass to guide specific conversations with specific people to a better place. So obnoxious aggression is what happens when you challenge, but you forget to show you care. That is very different from radical candor. In fact, one time I was working to roll out radical candor with a team actually at Google, and somebody marched into the room and said, "In the spirit of radical candor," and then this person sort of proceeded to behave like a garden variety jerk. And that is not the spirit of radical candor. It's a spirit of obnoxious aggression. So if that's happening, call it compassionate candor, not radical candor. So one of the many problems with obnoxious aggression is that instead of moving us, when we realize we've acted like a jerk, instead of moving us up on the care personally dimension towards radical candor, it very often is instinctive for most of us, including for me, to go the wrong way on the challenge directly dimension. And then you wind up in what I call manipulative insincerity, the dreaded lower left-hand quadrant. And this is where passive aggressive behavior, political behavior, all of the stuff that makes workplaces feel unsafe, actually, that destroys psychological safety creeps in. And it's fun to tell stories about obnoxious aggression and manipulative insincerity, because this is where the drama comes in. But the fact of the matter is, the vast majority of us make the vast majority of our mistakes in the upper left-hand quadrant, when we do remember to show that we care personally, because despite everything that we see on social media, most people are actually pretty nice. So we do remember to show that we care personally, but we forget to show people, to challenge directly. We're so concerned about not hurting someone's feelings that we fail to tell them something they'd be better off knowing about in the long run. And that I call ruinous empathy.
So a lot of danger zones there.
Yeah, that we all fall into. It doesn't mean we're bad people. It means we're human beings.
Yeah, hard to get just right, and I'm sure it takes a lot of practice.
Yes.
I think the other thing it takes is a lot of trust, right? I think inherently, to be a good recipient of feedback and to be a good giver of feedback, there needs to be trust in a relationship. And so I think a lot of folks would be interested in your point of view, Kim, on how do you build trust in these work relationships? Like, what have you found to be super effective?
Yeah, the seeds of trust are actually sown in radical candor. So I think it's tempting to think, oh, I'm going to hang out in ruinous empathy because that feels like a safer place to be. And after I get to know the person, then I'm going to move over to radical candor. But this is a flaw. I think if you consider a really simple example, like you're having lunch with someone for the very first time, you've just met them, and they've got spinach in their teeth. You know that the right thing to do is to tell them, because if you don't tell them, then they're going to go to the bathroom and think, gosh, why didn't Kim tell me that I had spinach in my teeth, And the same thing applies to a myriad of work situations. So you want to make, in fact, for me, the origin story of radical candor happened in the space of time that it took a light to change on the streets of Manhattan. I had this puppy, this golden retriever, Belvedere, and I loved Belvedere. I loved her so much that I had never said a cross word to her, and she was totally out of control. In fact, I used to take her to Google, and one day she like jumped up on somebody's desk and ate all their breakfast. So anyway, Belvedere was totally out of control, and so I'm taking her for a walk, and she jumped in front of a speeding car. So I pulled her out of the way just in time, and I'm standing on the street corner. My heart is in my throat, and this perfect stranger looks at me and he says, I can tell you really love that dog. And that is all he has to do to move up on the care personally dimension of radical candor. He doesn't have to know my kids' names or remember my birthday or take me out to lunch, nothing. He just has to notice my humanity in the moment. But he says to me, you're going to kill that dog if you don't teach her to sit. And he points at the ground in this very harsh way, and he says, sit. The dog sat. I had no idea she even knew what that meant. I kind of looked up at him in amazement, and he says, it's not mean, it's clear. So especially if you feel like you're struggling with ruinous empathy, that is a pretty good mantra for radical candor and for understanding how radical candor actually builds trust. Your silence does not build trust. And if you're silent about things for too long, you build up what I call feedback debt. It's not technical debt, but it's feedback debt. And feedback debt is just as bad for a relationship as technical debt is for a product.
I love this clarity point. I think Brene Brown has a similar phrase. She says, clear is kind, unclear is unkind.
Yes.
And pretty similar, pretty straightforward thing. And sometimes we have to remind ourselves, though, of that, because sometimes it takes a little bit of courage. But knowing that it is actually kind, I think really helps people.
Yeah, it takes a lot of courage, actually. It's like I wrote the book. I believe in this to my core, and I still am reluctant to say things often, like on a daily basis.
Yeah, so I'm really interested in giving people some tips, really helping them. So I was thinking about feedback, and I was thinking about asking for feedback, and I wonder, do you have a go-to question or some helpful suggestions for folks who want to ask for feedback?
Yes. So there's 4 things to remember about asking for feedback. The first thing is just remember to do it, by the way. So that's the pre thing. So the first thing is your go-to question. And the go-to question that I like to ask, actually, I learned from my coach when I was at Google. And he said, ask people, what could I do or stop doing that would make it easier to work with me? And I like that question, but that question kind of flows naturally for me. So there's a few things for you about your question. The first is, don't just adopt my words or Fred Kaufman's words. Figure out how you're going to ask. It's got to feel authentic to you, because if it feels weird for you to say that, then the other person is not going to believe that you want to know the answer. So I was working with Krista Quarles when she was the CEO of OpenTable. And she said, I could never imagine those words coming out of my mouth. She said, instead, I like to say, tell me why I'm wrong. And that's fine. That's an okay way to, but the question is, you want to make sure that these are your words, that it sounds authentic to you, but you also want to make sure that your words work for the other person. Communication is a two-way street. And so even though I like my question, when someone I'm working with doesn't like my question, I adjust it. So I started this company, Radical Candor, with Jason Rosoff, who a bunch of your people on your team have been working with. And he told me, after we'd been working together for a little while, he said, I hate that question. It's too open-ended. It makes me feel put on the spot. And so I had to learn how to adjust for him. So make sure that if you're not getting an answer to your question, then adjust it. So number 1 is come up with your question, and don't just say, do you have any feedback for me? I can already tell you what the answer is. Oh no, everything's fine. So make sure it can't be answered. Like, I think in the book, actually, I said, is there anything I could do or stop doing? And I got some feedback on that question, that I should ask, what could I do or stop doing that would make it easier to work with me? So try to make sure you're asking a question that way. Now, the next thing you need to do is to embrace the discomfort. I think that I often decided that I often thought that if I can just make people comfortable, they'll tell me the truth. But that is a fallacy. People are not ever going to be, no matter how good your question is, people don't want to give you the answer. So you've got to learn how just to embrace the discomfort. The simple tactic here is close your mouth and count to 6. I only made it to 3, and I could tell you're about to say something, Lisa. Almost nobody can endure 6 seconds of silence. So you want to make sure that you give a person the opportunity to say something. They may not say the most profound thing, but they're going to say something. So this brings us to step number 3. Now you've dragged this poor soul out on a conversational limb they never wanted to go on. It is crucial that you listen to what they say with the intent to understand, not to respond. And simple tactics to do this are repeat back what you think you heard. You may have heard it wrong. You also can just ask some follow-up questions. Sometimes you really didn't get it the first time. In fact, recently my daughter said to me, "Mom, I wish you weren't the radical candor lady." And immediately I had this huge wave of parental guilt. I thought, oh, I'm working too hard. She wants more time with me. And then I thought, well, I should make sure I understand what she's trying to tell me. And so I said, well, who do you wish I were? And she said, I wish you were the lady who minded her own business. So as far as she was concerned, I could go to a few more work meetings. That would be fine. So you want to make sure you understand the nature of the feedback. So that's number 3. Last but not least, step number 4, you've got to reward the candor. If people take a risk when they offer you radical candor, and it's like a financial risk. If you take a risk, you expect a higher return. And same thing with an emotional risk. If you take a risk, you expect a return. So it's incumbent upon you when you get the candor to reward it. So if you agree with the feedback, it's pretty straightforward. You fix the problem and then you ask the person, did I go far enough? Did I overcorrect? You make sure they know what you did to try to address it and that you're asking for more feedback. If you disagree with the feedback, and this is really important because this is radical, do not pretend that you agree with feedback that you disagree with. That is not going to help you get more of it. The way to reward candor that you disagree with is first to look for that 5 or 10% of whatever the other person said that you can agree with, just to demonstrate that you're not shut down to feedback. And then say to them, as for the rest of it, I want to think about it and get back to you. And then you got to get back to them and talk about it. I think we're often primed to believe that a disagreement is going to hurt our relationships. But actually, some of the best relationships I made at Google started with a very healthy disagreement. And so you want to make sure that you are giving the person an opportunity to understand how you think about the issue and also to argue with you, to disagree with you. And at some point, you've got to listen, challenge, commit. You can't argue endlessly. But sometimes a little bit of argument is actually, it feels inefficient, feels like something we'd rather not spend time on, but a little argument can actually save a lot of time and improve your relationship in the long run.
Yeah, no.
So that's soliciting feedback.
I love that. So you talk about a lot of things in radical candor. We've spent a bunch of time now on the feedback portion, but I want to make sure we get to some of the other really, really helpful kind of management philosophies or tips, which is, you talk a lot and meetings, right?
Yeah.
And we all spend a ton of time in meetings. And certainly now we're doing a lot of video meetings, which I think are even harder than in-person meetings. So tell us your philosophy. Like, what is your view on how to make meetings or one-on-ones, more valuable, more productive?
I think for one-on-one meetings in particular, it's really important to go into them with the right mindset. And it's one of the most important meetings of your week. If you're managing someone or if you have a boss, either way, which I think includes all of us, it's really important that you form a relationship with that person. And so I'm a huge believer in having, if possible, as few direct reports so that you can afford to meet with each of them once a week. If you have tons of direct reports, you may have to do it every other week. And those go into those meetings with the same mindset that you would go into having lunch with an old, with an old friend, or better yet, having lunch with someone who you don't know, but who you find interesting. And that really changed my approach to one-on-one meetings. I think they're really important. I also talk in the book about sort of being very clear and explicit about big decision meetings and big debate meetings, and letting people know whether the goal of this meeting is to have a debate or to make a decision. Because very often especially when there's an issue that people have a lot of strong opinions and passions around, some of the conflict, interpersonal conflict, emerges from the fact that half the people think they're there to have a debate and the other half think they're there to make a decision. And the debaters think the deciders are trying to rush, and the deciders think the debaters are wasting their time. So if you can be very clear about what the purpose of those meetings is, it can be really helpful. And I think if you have a staff meeting, it's a really good idea never to make a decision in your staff meeting. And this is controversial. Not everybody agrees. But I found, when I had both at my startups and also at Google, when I had a staff meeting, the following would happen. Everybody who was in it thought it was taking too long and it was a waste of time. And everybody who wasn't there felt sad and bad and left out. And the reason was, I realized that we were making decisions in the meeting, and we weren't including people who were closest to the facts. So your goal as a leader is to sort of push decisions into the facts. And so what we did in my staff meeting was to decide what the big decisions were. And then we would have a separate big decisions meeting, and everyone on the team was invited to the big decisions meeting. And because people, at first it was too big, but because people really hate meetings, that fixed itself. And the people who needed to be there were there, and the people who didn't need to be there would happily skip the meeting. So that was really helpful in terms of making everyone feel included and also not wasting time.
That is an unusual approach to making decisions, I'll say, to say the least. So maybe one last question on radical candor, and then we'll move on. So you talk as well about the importance of hiring, and obviously a lot of these things that we're talking about are both outputs of culture and help create culture. And I think hiring is a really important part of culture. I mean, I often say, like, companies create the conditions for culture, but people create culture.
Yeah.
So the choosing of the people on the team is just such an important thing. And I wonder if you could share some of the things you've learned about hiring and your advice for folks as they're thinking about building out their teams.
Yeah, I don't know if you all still use the same 4 criteria in ATS, or even if you still call it ATS, but I think there was one mistake that I often made around the googly. We're sort of looking for culture fits with googly, and I think that is a giant lane for bias to creep into your hiring decisions. And when bias creeps into your hiring decisions, you are actually discriminating, because you have the power to put that bias into practice. So now you've got discrimination occurring. So I think it's really important to look for culture adds, not necessarily culture fits. You want to constantly be evolving the culture and gaining new perspectives. So I think that is one thing that I thought a lot about in the course of writing Just Work. I think that the more you can manage to do experiments where you're stripping personally identifiable information out of resumes, so that you're stripping unconscious bias out of the selection and who you're deciding to bring in for interviews, is really great and really important. And Google, you all can afford to do this. It's a pain in the neck, and it's kind of cumbersome. Trier, who I started Just Work with, was like, oh, would never have done that at our company. But it's worth doing. At least do it as an experiment to notice if you get a more diverse candidate set. So that's really important, I think, in hiring. I think also the more you can do sort of skills assessments that are not in person, the better, so that you don't have an opportunity to have bias impact your decision, your assessment of their skills. And I think for an awful lot of roles at Google, that ought to be possible. It's incredible to take a look at what happened when they started putting a curtain up in front of orchestra, not interviews. What do you call it? Anyway,
Audition.
whatever. Yes, exactly. Auditions. Thank you. Went from like 2% orchestras that were 2% women to 50-50. It did not, there are deeper issues around race, and there's a lot more to be said about that example. But it's really important to assess people's skills independent of their identity. And then when you do assess for culture and the kind of culture ad you're looking for, be explicit. Write down what you're looking for, because if you're not explicit about what you're looking for, you're going to have this kind of blank reaction, and there's a lot of bias often in those blank reactions. So Daniel Kahneman writes a lot about this in Thinking Fast and Slow, and the importance of using an algorithmic approach to assessing for culture, which I think will work well at Google.
Yeah, we actually do culture ad training now at Google.
That's good.
Anyone who's doing interviewing needs to understand how to screen for culture ad, to your point. So let's talk a little bit about just work. And I think you were just talking about bias. So let's talk about, you differentiate in this book between bias and prejudice and bullying. So can you tell us about the difference?
Sure. I think it's really useful to sort of break apart when we're faced with a problem that seems sort of monolithic and insoluble, whether it's a math problem or a social problem. I think it's really important to break it down into its component parts. And so for me, the root causes of the problem are bias, prejudice, and bullying. And because we often conflate them, people are skeptical that unconscious bias is really the problem, because what they really are worried about is prejudice. And prejudice also exists, or bullying. So I'm going to offer some very simple definitions. Bias is not meaning it. It's often unconscious. Prejudice is meaning it. It is a consciously held belief, usually upholding some kind of nonsensical stereotype. And bullying is just being mean. There's no belief inherent in bullying at all. The person is just using very often personal attributes to be mean, to cause harm. So meaning harm. So that's bias, prejudice, and bullying in a nutshell. Lots of stories that help distinguish between the two, and lots of different thoughts about how to respond to each. Whether you are the upstander, whether you observe this happening and you don't want to be the silent bystander, whether you are the leader, or whether you're the person harmed by these things.
Yeah, I think in the book you make very clear distinctions between those three roles, but you also acknowledge that any given person can be any of those roles. One person can be the victim at the same time in another action. They could intentionally or unintentionally, right, be the person who is being biased and or demonstrating other kinds of behaviors, right? And so I think this is a really important concept, right? That you aren't a bad person or a good person in most scenarios, right? You unfortunately could behave badly in a particular situation, and in another moment you could actually be the victim. And so I think that's an important concept in the book.
Yeah, and I learned that actually from something Alan Eustace used to do when he was engineering leader at Google. He would get up in front of his team and he would say, if you are underrepresented along any dimension and you have been harmed by someone on your team in the last week, not ever in your career, but in the last week, raise your hand. 100% of the underrepresented people raised their hand in the meeting. And then he said, okay, put your hands down. And then he said, if you have harmed one of your colleagues in the last week, if you've been unjust to them along some dimension, raise your hand. Nobody raised their hand. And Alan said, there's the problem. And so I think very often we, when I wrote Just Work, it was, as I mentioned in the story about giving the talk at the tech company in San Francisco, it was very hard for me to come to grips with my role as a victim, as a person harmed. But it was even harder for me to come to grips with my role as a person who caused harm. I don't want to think of myself as a victim, even less do I want to think of myself as a perpetrator. And yet, if I want to do better, I have to learn how to acknowledge when I've done the wrong thing.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about this word upstander. And I think a lot of people aspire to not be a bystander, but to be an upstander. But you talk about a bunch of things that actually get in the way of being an upstander, and I want to hear about that, but I also want to hear, like, what do you think people need to do to behave as upstanders?
Yeah, I think the key thing there is to intervene, but I also want to acknowledge it's very difficult to intervene. It's like, it's hard to know what to say when you don't know what to say. And here's I like to sort of think about these things in terms of stories. So here's a story about an excellent upstander. So Aileen Lee, who founded Cowboy VC, told me a story about being in a meeting. She went into a meeting with two colleagues who were men, and they sat down at the table, one of those big, long conference tables. They filed in, sat down, and then the other people from the other company started filing in. And the first guy came in and sat across from the guy. Both of Aileen's colleagues were men. From the guy to Aileen's left, the next person came in and sat across from the guy to his left, and then they filed on down the table, leaving Aileen kind of dangling off by herself. And that's often where bias starts, just in the way we seat ourselves in a meeting. But nobody was really aware of it. And Aileen had the skills that was going to win her team the deal. And so she started talking, and when the other side had questions, they directed the questions at her colleagues who were men, not at her. Anybody ever experienced that before or observed that before? And it happened once, it happens twice, it happened a third time. And eventually her colleague stood up and he said, I think Aileen and I should switch seats. And they did, and the whole dynamic in the room changed. And he did that. This is part of the double entendre of the just in Just Work. He did that because he wanted to be fair to Aileen. He liked Aileen, and he didn't like seeing her get ignored, so he wanted to be fair to her. But he also did it because he just wanted to win the deal, and he knew if he couldn't get the other side to listen to her, that they wouldn't win the deal. And so the bias, prejudice, and bullying, they are deeply unfair to the people who are harmed by them, but they harm everyone. They hurt our ability to collaborate. They hurt our ability to make good decisions. They hurt our ability to perform both as individuals and collectively. And so that's why it's so important to root them out of the workplace. It's tempting to think, and a lot of times I'll get questions along this line. People will think of it as, the distraction is talking about this stuff. But no, the distraction is not talking about the problem. The problem is the distraction.
Yeah, fair enough. I want to touch on one other thing that you talk about in the book around, empowering or encouraging underrepresented folks to speak up. And I think in the book you say, people who are underrepresented don't need to be told to speak up or, empowered to speak up or told to be more confident. So what do we need to do instead?
Yeah. I think I quoted Ruth Bader Ginsburg about, like, just stop preventing. Don't tell me to speak up. Just take your foot off. Take your foot off my throat, which resonates very differently after George Floyd. I want to acknowledge that. It is really important not to, as an upstander, not to fall into the role of knight in shining armor or white savior. It's really important to remember that the idea of an upstander is to stand up to injustice. You're not standing up for someone who somehow needs you or is weaker than you in some way. I think there are a lot of things that leaders can do, and there are a lot of things that upstanders can do. And it's really the first thing is to acknowledge that this is everyone's job, not to put all of the work of fixing the problems on the people who are harmed by the problems. This is something that we all need to do. So one of the, just to get very specific and tactical here, one of the things that leaders can do is to create a bias disruptor, a norm of bias disrupting on the team. So there's 3 parts to bias disrupting. The first part is to come up with a shared vocabulary of what you're going to say in a meeting when you notice bias, no matter who you are in the meeting. And this is hard because it's tricky. This is where the problem begins, because we don't know what to say. So some teams have used Daniel Kahneman's language. There's a team we work with who uses a peace sign. Trier and I use a purple flags, which we wave all the time at each other. And as soon as we see the purple flag, we know someone has said something biased in the meeting. The second part is to have a shared norm of how to respond when you're the person who said the biased thing. And this is so important because when someone points my bias out to me, and I imagine everyone here feels something similar, I feel ashamed. And I feel ashamed if I know what I've done wrong because I've harmed someone. But sometimes someone points out my bias and I don't even know what it is that I've done wrong exactly or said wrong. And then I feel doubly ashamed because not only have I harmed someone else, I also am ignorant, and that's hard to come to grips with. So just coming up with the norm of saying, thanks for pointing it out. I get it. I'm going to work on it. And by the way, I'm going to work on it means I'm going to work on it. Very often these phrases are hard to change. Like there was one CEO I was working with, and he was really trying to change his habit of saying you guys. And this was like, it was not easy. It was, other people have said it was easy for them. It was hard for him. It's easy for me because I grew up in the South. So saying y'all falls naturally off the tongue. But I think that it is really important to sort of acknowledge that we're going to have to be patient and persistent with each other. Not just patient, but also persistent. We're going to have to wave the purple flag consistently with people. So that's one thing is thanks for pointing it out. I get it. I'll work on it. The other is thanks for pointing it out. I don't know what I did wrong. And getting people in the habit of saying that is really important, and liberating people to say, I don't know what it, and then you can't talk about it in the meeting. The promise of the book is you're going to get shit done fast and fair. And so talk to the person after the meeting, or if it's a Google Hangouts meeting, you can drop it into chat. You can drop an article or something in a chat. That is really helpful. So, and again, it shouldn't necessarily, especially if the person who was harmed by the bias, they shouldn't have to do the work of educating the person. Someone else in the meeting probably knows what happened. So that's the sort of the norms, the shared vocabulary, norm of how to respond. And then last but not least, you need a commitment to flag bias at least once in every meeting, because it's happening. I promise you, in every meeting, in every day, at least 1 or 2 or 3 biased things get said or done. And we are pattern makers and we can change the pattern. We're not the victims of our own patterns. We can change it, but only, as my son's baseball coach said, you can't do right if you don't know what you're doing wrong. So we need to educate each other and not just do unconscious bias training, because that can leave us with this feeling of, I can't help it. It's just the way, my mind works. We can change it, but we need to help each other change it. We need to flag it.
Yeah. I love that. I think it's so important. There's so much in this book, but one of the things that I really love about the book too is that while it's very heavy and a lot to emotionally and mentally process, I think you made a conscious choice to kind of end the book on optimism, right?
Yes.
And I think there's so much that's difficult in this moment. Talk a little bit about, what is it in this moment that, or in this time, that still makes you optimistic? Like, what are you optimistic about?
There are so many people who are telling so many stories. I think for so long we were silent about the kinds of things that were happening. And I think people feel safe in a new way to share their stories. And that creates such a feeling of solidarity. And we're not going to solve these problems. Divided we fall. And I think there's a shared commitment, a shared solidarity across differences to come together and to change things. And it's been really working with Trier Bryant, who was an officer in the Air Force and very senior at Goldman Sachs, and then worked at Twitter, and then was chief people officer at Astra, and also is a Black woman. Like, working together to solve these problems has been really fun and inspiring. I think, and also writing the book, like, I was reluctant to sort of to admit these stories to myself and to delve it. But once I wrote them, I felt lighter. It is really healing. So the work it is work, but like all work that takes us to a new place and creates a better world, it's fun to do good work. So.
Excellent. I think we have some audience questions, so let's go ahead and turn to those. Let's see what folks want to hear. Okay, so I say asks. So my question is this: have you come into situations where radical candor is inappropriate?
Yes, there have been times when I've been working with someone and giving them feedback, and they're rejecting the feedback, and I've worked very hard to push to get through to them, and I realize that there's a reason why they can't hear what they're doing wrong, and that the kinder thing is actually to part ways. So radical candor, I mean, I guess firing them is also the harshest form of radical candor, but it won't always work. So there are times when I just realized with this one person in particular, it would be cruel to keep going. I had to make a change, and then to help that person find a better place for them, a place that was going to be a better fit. There are also times when the issue is just too small. It's hard. It's hard to share. It's not. Don't devolve into nitpicking. A friend of mine said, if it's yellow, let it mellow. If it's brown, flush it down. So leave 3 unimportant things unsaid every day. That's a good rule for any relationship. And then also, I think, and this is one of the things I gave a lot of thought to, as you can imagine, when I wrote Just Work, very often bias, prejudice, or bullying even masquerade as feedback. And so learning to distinguish between legitimate feedback and bias, prejudice, and bullying is tricky. But that's an example of sometimes you're going to get some feedback that you disagree with and that you think is illegitimate. And so figuring out how to share that with the person who gave you the feedback it's very difficult, but it's possible to do. And sometimes when I've gotten that kind of, I've wound up having to quit. So make sure you know where your exit options are. Hopefully that's your last option, but you've got to make sure that you feel free.
All right, let's see if we have another question here. So Patricia says, excited to hear your talk, Kim. I would love to hear your thoughts on how to provide feedback up to a leader when you are in a satellite role where direct feedback might not be well received.
Yes, I will acknowledge this is this is also difficult. In fact, one time I gave a radical candor talk and somebody tweeted at me afterwards, tried radical candor on my boss, got fired. And I was like, oh no, I'm so sorry. You know, I know a lot of people, how can I help? And he's like, I'm better off, actually. I already got a new job. So luckily that ended okay. But I want to say a couple of things. One is that you know, not everywhere at Google, but most places at Google, feedback is very welcome. It's a very radically candid culture. So I just want to offer, at least in my experience, it was. So I want to offer that reassurance. I think no matter who you're giving radical candor to, you want to sort of follow a sort of order of operations. You want to start by soliciting feedback. You want to know what the other person, especially if it's your boss, but no matter who it is. So you want to solicit radical candor first. Then you want to give it, and you want to give both praise and criticism. I had a friend who worked on Wall Street, and she got a new job working for a person who had a reputation as being one of the biggest jerks on Wall Street, which was frankly saying something. And so she was a little bit nervous about this new role, and she adopted this mantra. And the mantra was, there is only love. And what she meant by that was not that she was going to be in denial about things that were going wrong, but that she was not going to talk badly about him to anyone, even her own husband. She would really she would look for the things she appreciated about working with this guy, and she would give voice to them. And when she had a problem with him, she would talk to him directly. And so that was, you know, I don't think it was the most fun part of her career, but they got through it. She got through it. And then you want to make sure that you gauge how it's landing. Radical candor does not get measured at your mouth. It gets measured at the other person's ear. And so if the person seems sad or mad, you want to move up on the care personally dimension. Although it's probably your instinct, if you're like me, if somebody's mad at me or yelling at me, either I yell back or I pull into my shell like a turtle and retreat to kind of a self-protective, manipulative insincerity. But this is your cue to get curious, not furious, and to try to move up a little bit on the care and to understand what's going on for that other person. And if you share the feedback with the other person and they seem to be dismissing you, kind of doing to you what I did to my boss, that's your cue to move out on the challenge directly dimension. And so kind of being conscious going into the conversation of gauging how it's landing for the other person and knowing when you need to move up on care personally or move further out on the challenge directly dimension, then might be careful, that might be comfortable, can help. The other thing I will say about being radically candid, sort of, in theory, it works the same up, down, and sideways, but it feels very different to up, down, and sideways. So it's easy for me to say, be radically candid, very hard for you to do it. But one of the things that really surprised me since the book came out is a number of emails I got from people who were managers who were afraid to give radical candor to their employees. And so my mother used to say to me, if you'd see a snake or something in the yard, she'd say, that snake is more afraid of you than you are of it. So just remember, very often, not that your boss is a snake, but often your boss is just afraid of you as you are of them. So try to approach your boss on a level playing field. I think there's very few things that are more damaging to a human relationship than a power imbalance. And so if you have power in the relationship, learn how to put it down. And if you don't have power in the relationship, learn how to pick it up.
All right. I think we have our next question. Shar says, any advice for helping white saviors change their behaviors to be more helpful?
Yeah, this is very difficult because the person thinks they're helping and they're often shut down to feedback that they're behaving in this way. There's a really good article called Protective Hesitation, and it's written about how reluctant people are to give feedback to their mentors when their mentors are doing things, either white savior things or biased things. And so learning how to have those conversations is really tricky. The thing that is helpful for me, I mean, I've probably been the white savior. I've been the person who caused harm, not the person harmed by it. But I've been harmed by being cast in the role of damsel in distress often enough. And that's frustrating because I don't want to be the damsel. That's not the role I want to play. And that's the problem with the white knight, or with the knight in shining armor. And so I think the thing that can be helpful is to learn sort of an I statement. An I statement invites someone in to understand things from your perspective. So I don't think you meant that the way it sounded, or I am finding I don't like the role that I'm being cast in this situation. It invites someone in to understand things from your perspective, and that's a good response to bias. Now, if you think it's prejudice, you need something different. You need an it statement. And an it statement can appeal to the law, it can appeal to an HR policy, or it can appeal to common human decency. So it is illegal not to hire someone because of their hair. It is an HR violation not to hire someone because of their hair, or it is ridiculous not to hire the most qualified candidate because of their hair, for example. Whereas bullying, if you think this person is bullying you, then you need a you statement. My daughter explained this to me, actually. She was in 3rd grade. She was getting bullied on the playground. And I was advising her to use an I statement. I feel sad when you blah, blah, blah. And she banged her fist on the table and she said, "Mom, he's trying to make me feel sad. Why would I tell him he succeeded?" And I thought, good point, really good point. And so a you statement can be, "You can't talk to me like that," or "You need to stop now." Or if that feels like it might escalate the situation too much, "What's going on for you here that you're, casting me in this role or playing this role?" Or even sometimes, "Where'd you get that shirt?" Just like change the subject, but you're not now in this receiving. You're on the, you're sort of getting them to answer your questions. So I think for me, and those situations where something feels wrong, and you don't have to know for sure whether it's bias, prejudice, or bullying. You often won't. But if you have a gut instinct and you decide, "I'm going to start with the word I," or "I'm going to start with the word it," or "I'm going to start with the word you," and just see what comes out of your mouth next. It's just, I want to have a lot of compassion for all. It's very hard to know how to respond in the moment when this happens.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, the next question. Linda says, "Hi, Kim. I like how you mentioned feedback debt. Any suggestions on how to get out of the hole once we're there without unfairly overwhelming the person?"
Yeah. So I think, especially in a team situation where sometimes there's kind of a culture of ruinous empathy has crept in, I think one of the things that can be helpful is sort of showing the person, if this doesn't feel too formal, show the person the framework and say, "Look, I feel like I've made this mistake and it's hurt our relationship, and I want to improve our relationship. So I'm going to try being more radically candid, but I want you to tell me when I'm accidentally being obnoxiously aggressive and when it doesn't feel right to you." So just being open. And the other thing I will say that has really helped me in those situations is to think like that, the story I told about being, think about that moment in your life or in your career where somebody told you something that maybe stung a little bit at the time, but stood you in good stead for the next 10 years. And when you think of that story, now all of a sudden you're hooking into your desire to be kind. And that can really help. You can also think about a time when you were ruinously empathetic and the impact that had. In the book, I tell this Bob story. So think of your Bob story when you had sort of a disastrous impact on both your relationship and on results because you didn't say something. And that will help you hold on to your desire to care personally, but realize what's kind in the long run. That's, by the way, here's another tip that doesn't help me, but it has helped a lot of other people. I got it actually from someone who I worked with at Google. He said, when I have to go in and tell someone something that might be hard for them to hear, I close my eyes before I start talking, and I envision the face of someone whom I love. And he said that always puts him in the right frame of mind to talk to the other person.
Yeah, that's a good one, actually. I've never heard that one before.
Yeah.
All right. Well, unfortunately, I think we're out of time. Kim, thank you so much for having so much courage, for sharing all of your wisdom. And I think both of these books have so many practical tips, like things you can actually, not just frameworks and concepts, but ways to put it into practice. So may we all have enough courage to practice these things that are so important for our lives and for our careers. And thank you so much for sharing it with all of us.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be back, and great questions. Thank you all for the engagement.